What is up, guys? This is Alex, and today we're gonna analyze the track that I published last week. That fantasy, ambient, relaxing, Skyrim-esque track that I published. And next week instead, I'm gonna write an original epic trailer track and make a tutorial about that. So if you're interested in that, then wait for next week. But today we're gonna talk about fantasy orchestration, how to achieve that relaxing sort of forest fantasy ambient sound. And as usual, we're gonna listen to the track first so you can hear what we're about to analyze here in this long tutorial. And I'm gonna play it in 3, 2, 1. So the first step is picking your instrumentation. This is very important to do in any genre that you make. Because if you think of a painter, before starting a painting, he chooses the colors to use and he puts them into his palette. This gives him the freedom to do this gives him the knowledge of what he's going to be able to do with this painting. And limiting the scope of what's going to be possible with your track is very important. It's an important thing to do if you want to avoid writer's block. And if you want to avoid going all over the place. So you pick beforehand your instruments beforehand, like a painter picks his colors beforehand, because he knows, okay, I'm gonna want to steer this sort of emotions into the people who look at the painting, so I'm gonna use these colors. With you and music must be the same. With fantasy music, you need to think, what is fantasy music? Well, fantasy music is something that kind of represents a fantasy ambience, right? So you're trying to represent not a fight, not a dragon and stuff like that. We're writing ambient, relaxing fantasy music. So we're trying to represent maybe the idea of walking in an uncharted forest or in a very big green field And fantasy music, fantasy genre is reminiscent of the Middle Age. It's kind of like the romanticized version of the Middle Age. So we might not want to use futuristic instruments like synthesizers and all those things, unless we want to have fantasy futuristic sound. So you need to think of what you're writing, and also then you need to think of what instruments belong to that sort of domain, that sort of realm. A cool thing to do is to listen to a lot of songs in that genre and figure out what are the instruments that are being used the most and the ways in which they're being used and all those things. So in the case of Jeremy Soule, one thing I noticed is that, or in general fantasy music, one thing I noticed is that, so these are a few of the instruments that are used. So one that I used straight away is the harp. Now the harp is kind of reminiscent a bit of, elves and all those things, in my opinion. So I think it really fits. It has that sort of natural forest sound. So I used Cine harps for the harps, and I did use them quite a lot in this track. Then another important instrument family might be the woodwinds. Now for the woodwinds, I used CineWinds core, and I used a few, in this track. I think this is the track that I used where I used woodwinds the most. Another important, because they just have the sort of like forest sound, like they just sound like that for me. And also notice that they were used a lot in Oblivion soundtrack and in Skyrim a little bit. So that was the sound I was going for. So I used woodwinds a lot. Another instrument, very important, is actually solo vocals, like these guys. This is Merete Solvet. It's the Merete Solvet's patch from Jaeger, from Audio Imperia. And it has this sort of solo vocals which sound super ethereal, like an elvish, singer or something. So this really gives that fantasy edge to the song. Also, another thing I used, one thing I didn't use actually is percussion. And this is for a few reasons. I'm going to talk about that maybe a bit more later, but if you notice, like if you have a good hearing, you have a good attention, you might have noticed that this track sounds gentle, and all the instruments I use kind of sound gentle. I didn't use, big percussion like I usually do. I love to write, huge percussion and stuff like that. But if you want to write something that sounds relaxing, you need to not use something that sounds powerful, So as for percussion, I mostly use cymbals, rolls, and Metropolis. I'm not sure if Metropolis is the right name for this sort of sound. Or this sort of sparkly percussion that creates a sense of wonder, just like a fantasy forest would. So those are other instruments I use. Both are from East West Symphonic Orchestra. Then I also used a bit of brass actually, and I wouldn't use brass so much in this sort of music because French horn and all those sort of huge brass instruments, they convey a sense of epicness and hugeness, right? That's why Hans Zimmer's score for Inception was so freaking massive. The use of French horn there is like bananas. I have no idea how many bass trombones and French horns they use in that score, and it just gives that huge sense to the track. And we just want to recreate an intimate emotion, feeling of walking alone in an uncharted forest. So using loud French horn doesn't make sense. Although in Skyrim, I noticed that Jeremy Soule did use a bit of French horn and trumpets, but they sound a bit like this. Like he used them, but they're not super loud. They're mostly like muted and a bit in the distance. Now, this trumpet actually sounds a bit more Western than fantasy, but the trumpet, it's a good example of what I mean by muted. When you listen to it with the whole arrangement, it doesn't take over so much as it does in my other arrangements, because I used it with such low dynamics that it sounds a bit muted and a bit more gentle. Gentle is the word for this sort of arrangement. And a cool thing is that adding it does create that sort of fantasy feel and that sort of like chivalry and stuff, because French horn is a bit epic, but in this case, it sounds like epic in the sense that you are there walking in a huge valley. It's like epic in the sense that it makes the whole image look huge, rather than making it look huge and powerful. So if you use brass but use it muted, then you can create a bit of that vast sense. Another thing I used, for the brass I used I used Century brass from Itaio. For the strings, I think, I used Cine strings too, along with Jaeger a little bit, and I also used a bit of choir, just because I think it fits for the same reason as the solo vocals, and also use a bit of solo cello. The solo cello is Tina Guo's solo cello from Cine Samples, yes. And the choir is from Stormchoir 2. So those are the instruments I use. And again, if you notice, I didn't use loud French horn, loud brass. I didn't use loud percussion. And I didn't use lots of short articulations, which is something I'm going to talk about in the next point, relaxation. So the second point, relaxation, let's talk about it. Basically, you want your song to sound very easy to listen to and relaxing, soothing, kind of. It doesn't need to sound epic. It needs to sound as if it's something that you could actually sleep listening. Well, you could actually fall asleep to. And I have actually a full playlist of like 30 hours of music from different games that sounds relaxing, because I really love that genre of music. And if you want to access it, you're interested, I'm going to link it in the description of this video. But basically, if you listen to all those songs, you're going to notice they have something in common. Or rather, they don't, there's some things that all those tracks do not have. And one of the things that they do not have is powerful rhythms and, powerful percussion, all those things. Because if you introduce powerful percussion in a fantasy arrangement or in a relaxing arrangement, then it's going to take away the relaxation. It's going to make it a bit challenging to listen to and a bit energetic, which is not a bad thing, but it's not something you want if you want to write a relaxing track. So in this track, I didn't use lots of percussion on purpose. Now, in Jeremy Soule's music, sometimes he uses timpani, to do like timpani rolls. So, instead of doing them with cymbals, sometimes he might do it rolls like, stuff like that. Or he might use timpani at very slow rhythms just to enforce a few of the notes. I give a bit of that, accent sometimes, but varies like doom, doom, not the bum, 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 So if you use percussion, you need to use it just as a way to provide that sense of hugeness. Because again, in this case, if I use timpani, I would have created a bit of sense of hugeness because of the sound of the timpani. As I mentioned in the tutorial where I analyzed the Bloodborne and Hans Zimmer orchestrations, timpani just makes your arrangement sound more vast, kind of. It's like a huge beating heart that you hear, the sort of timpani sound. That's what it sounds like, and just creates a sense of vastness. So it can be useful. I didn't use it because I didn't want to, but you can use it. But you might not want to use toms and damage and epic dhols and epic toms from Itaio. So the absence of percussion is one thing I noticed. Another thing I noticed is the absence, mostly, of short articulations like spiccatos. Because what you want to have, if you want to create a sort of relaxing sound to your track, you need to have something that sounds like this. Like it's this sort of like pad, like it's like a and that would work, but it wouldn't be relaxing because it would be energetic, challenging, and alive with power and all those things, which is something we don't need here. What we need here is a soothing sound. It needs to sound, like a calm river going through, very relaxing. That's what you want your whole instrumentation, your whole orchestration to sound like. Now, a way in which you can do this is to avoid using short articulations like staccatos and staccatos and spiccatos. Pizzicatos are useful. We're gonna see that later. But basically, use lots of sustains and legatos and tremolos. Tremolos can be a useful way to build tension in a sustained way, kind of. We're gonna see about that later, maybe. But one thing you need to do if you use a lot of sustains is, first thing, as I mentioned in the tutorial, how to write realistic strings, which I recommend you to watch because it talks about some things we're not going to mention here. First thing you might want to do is to split your, if you're writing sustained chords, you can split them like this. Instead of just doing chords on your ensemble patch and that's all, do that. You can do them on ensemble patch. I did them here, but I also did split the chords in multiple voices through the span of all the different string family. I also did that sometimes on vocals and all those things. And there's a reason for it. It's just going to make you think a bit differently. It's just going to make you arrange in a way where you add more detail. We're going to see that later on the third point. But the most important thing, use MIDI control commands. Here, what you see, these lines, they're MIDI control commands. They control the mod wheel. Like it kind of goes down and up in intensity, and it kind of feels real now, because you simulate the dynamic change in the bowings of the real string players. And if you do not know how to do that, check out my tutorial on strings, as I mentioned before, and that really helps. If you do it like on a single instrument, it can be subtle, but if you do it on the whole orchestration, oh man, it gets very realistic. Another thing I did to make it even more evident, after doing all the MIDI control commands, I took this and I pretty much linked this to every single instrument. And this is a volume automation, so it goes up and down, up and down, up and down, just as I wanted to, So I did that to shape this sort of dynamics even further. So that's another thing you may want to do. And this gives you the freedom to use, sustains and all those things, but do it in an interesting way. Another thing very important for easy listening is that your melodies need to sound not remarkable. They need to sound easily rememberable, easily to remember, easy to internalize, because again, you're not trying to challenge people here. You're trying to make people feel at home. People feel in the space. Just make them feel where you want them to bring them very clearly. So you need to take them by hand from beginning to end. So using melodies that are easy to remember is a great idea. And this is something I thought about in the tutorial, how to write great melodies and counter melodies by ear. So for example, in this track, I think, yes, in this part, the main melody is on harp, I think. If you check out this melody, the thing you notice is that it uses the same rhythmic pattern almost all the time. This rhythm, and it repeats itself again and repeats itself again, but here it changes on the last bit. But basically, same rhythm, same pattern, very predictable melody. It doesn't go weird places like, no, it's like, same rhythm, same pattern in the way that some notes go up, some notes go down. And something I talked about in the tutorial, in the Great Melodies and Counter Melodies tutorial. So if you want to learn how to write melodies like this, check out that tutorial. But basically, yes, use melodies that are easy to listen to. And if you want to prevent them from getting predictable, you can do stuff like I did here in the solo cello and solo vocals. So this is a counter melody to the main melody, which in this part, so this melody repeats itself quite a while in this track, quite a few times. And this first repetition, I first took this melody and transitioned it to celesta. So instead of keeping it on the concert harp, I moved it one octave higher and I moved it on celesta. So it sounds like this now. And then I also introduced this counter melody on solo cello. And again, the idea was not to challenge the listener, so I wrote something with a certain pattern, easy to listen to, etc. And so I just did it because I didn't want to repeat this melody again without bringing anything new to the table. It's not something you need to do. It's just a detail you can add to make your track a bit more interesting. So that's what I did. And to make things even more interesting for me, because I'm a very melodic person, I decided to add a counter melody to that counter melody. So there's the solo vocals doing this on top of the cellos, playing sometimes when the cellos rest. And in this bit, they get together. So this is something, I talked about in the great Contra Melodies and Melodies by Ear tutorial. But yeah, in this first bit, you have this Contra Melody on the cello and the vocals doing something else. And this works because every single, the melody here sits in a certain register, very high register. The cello sits in a sort of mid register in terms of frequencies. And the vocals sit in another register again, So they are not fighting each other. They're, complete. They come together in a very constructive way. And in this certain part, both the solo vocals, the solo cello, and the celesta come together and do the same thing. So that's why this bit is very powerful. And, it sounds interesting because it's not the same repetition left like that. I added 2 counter melodies and then they come together. So it just creates a bit of, mystery for a second, and then you go and you just do the main melody again. So, I'm just a very melodic person again. You don't need to do this. I just wanted to do it to make this a bit more interesting. But still, I kept it very easy and understandable and easy to listen to. So using very basic melodies and all those things can be very, useful. And you can make them sound a bit less boring if you use counter melodies. But again, the counter melodies too, they don't need to sound too, incredible. You can use the same rhythm as the main melody. And I did that even here, for example, I think around here. This is my favorite bit of the song. No, sorry, this is my favorite bit of the song, like here. So here the melody, and then in this part it comes back to, it sounds like this. But it sounds more interesting. Now the reason for it is that again I added counter melody. So we have the on violins. But we also have this counter melody. I think on... Is it on French horn or trumpets? Okay, so we have this counter melody on... No, sorry. So the trumpets and second violins are playing the main melody. And I put them on second violins and trumpets because they are pretty much the highest instruments in terms of tonality in this arrangement. So the highest instruments, as I usually say, are the ones where we really pay the ear really pays attention to, even if their volume is not as high as other instruments. Being so high in tonality, they are the ones that are the most noticeable. So that's why I put the main melody on such a high instruments. But then I also added a counter melody. I on French horn and flute, I think. It sounds like this. Okay, actually this is the counter melody. And this is the favorite, like in this whole orchestration, this is the favorite thing I've wrote for me. So that's the counter melody I use. If you notice, it uses the same exact rhythm as the main melody. In the sense that the notes change with the same rhythm. But in terms of the notes I chose, they are different. And it's also different in a way that, it goes up or down. Sometimes when the main melody goes up, the counter melody goes down, and sometimes it's the opposite. And sometimes they go up and down together. But yeah, I added that counter melody, and then I also did something else. In the solo cello, there's this. So, in this part, then it does this. So basically, this is playing the same counter melody as the flute, pretty much. So it's like a layer to the flute. But I didn't begin... Again, I just did this because I wanted to make this a bit more interesting. It's not something you need to do, but it's a way in which you can use predictable melodies in a fresh way. So this part, this solo cello is just again layer to this flute, but it begins in a different way. The way it begins, it sounds like it did here. Like da 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 da. It's you feel like you heard that before, so it's not super challenging. But then you're like, oh, what is gonna happen? And then it goes along with the flute. So it kind of, it's an illusion. Da, 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 da. So it begins doing its own thing, and then it merges with the flute. So we're keeping things simple, but making them a bit interesting by adding little details like that. And then there's a French horn doing something else. This is just harmonies though, I think. Yeah, pretty much in the beginning it was doing the French horn, just like the cello, the solo cello. In the beginning, it does its own thing, and then it merges with the rest, I think, if I remember correctly. And yeah, below that you have, nice chords, of course. So if I remove all the sort of melodic instruments here, these guys. So this is just, you could call it a chord progression. The cool thing is that in this chord progression, you sort of have movement in the way that some, it's not just this blocky chord that has the same rhythm in every single voice. Some voices change independently, like the violas here. And that's something I talked about in the tutorial, how to write chord progressions by ear, I think. I show my way in which I write chord progressions. So another cool thing you might want to have is, of course, chord progressions written and distributed on the span of different instruments, written in a way that sounds interesting. Before writing this track, I think I sketched it on piano here, and then I took this sketch and I orchestrated it vertically, as I show in the. I don't remember. I think I orchestrated vertically where I took a single part and I orchestrated the whole part, and I took another part, orchestrated the whole part. So, you might want to do that with chords and split them throughout different instruments. That's something I talk about in the writing chord progression by ear tutorial. I actually write on how to write a chord progression. There's also another tutorial where I talk about how to orchestrate a chord progression and write an entire track out of that. I'm gonna link that in the description as well. Lots of tutorials to watch. But yeah, so have nice chord progressions that sound, basic but well layered. Have melodies that sound easy to follow, but still a bit interesting, a bit of outliers, like I showed you here. And okay, so another thing you might have noticed about the melodies is that the leading instrument, or rather the instrument that plays the main melodies, etc., it changes every time on each repetition. This is something I started to do lately, and I noticed that it increases the quality of your music so much. It's something I talked about in the tutorial, how to make melodies stand out in any arrangement. So in any, in this part that we just listened to, it's so powerful because, in this part, you feel the melody on the solo vocals and the solo cello, and then in this bit, it goes a bit to the trumpets, and rather than solo vocals, it's now the actual choir playing it. And then here, changes again. It goes to high strings, the woodwinds, and solo cello. The melody, the motif, kind of stays the same. Here it changes a bit, but it's always the same sort of motif repeating itself. And if I play this thing on piano, maybe it will get boring. But since I change instrument all the time, changing the leading instrument leads me to kind of change the orchestration a bit as well. And that way, I just keep things fresh and interesting. So I highly recommend you to do that in your arrangements, any genre arrangement you might write. Whenever you're repeating a melody or stuff like that, change the instrument in which you're repeating it, change the octave, introduce new counter melodies and stuff like that. That is gonna make it possible for you to write music with very simplistic melodies, but it's still gonna you're gonna write simplistic melodies, but they're still gonna sound fresh and amazing because you change the way in which they sound by changing instruments and octaves all the time. So that's one thing I highly recommend. Another thing also is that before each repetition, there is something happening. So for example, in this bit, there is a Contra Melody. So we have ba-da-ba-ba-ba, ba-da-ba-ba, but in the background you have this. This was in the original song from Nobuo Uematsu. But what I did is I made use of this to kind of like do this. Like before this second repetition comes in, you kind of feel like this first repetition is like I do a statement where I say, okay, this is the end of this repetition. Here comes a new repetition, which is gonna sound a bit different. I say that by doing this sort of thing with the French horn, that ba high note makes it clear this is a statement. This is a a dot, and a new statement is about to come. If I didn't put this, it will still work, but I really like the way in which the French horn makes it kind of final. Just creates that tension, like, nah, and you're like, what is gonna come next? Like, it feels like, okay, something is happening. So, when you want to write melodies, a cool thing to do is before a repetition, or even better, before the end of that melody, write something that makes it, like, increases the tension in a way that the listener expects that something's about to change, Because one thing that I really hate listening to is melodies that repeat themselves, and at the second repetition where the chorus is over and stuff like that, they don't have anything that tells me, okay, this is the statement, this is the end, something new is coming. So it's like, and you're like, okay, what it's just, I cannot think of an example because I'm just used to writing melodies in that way, but basically just write melodies in a way that when they end, they say it, Change a note, make it go higher and stuff like that. Think of ways in which to write melodies in a way that expresses the change that is about to come. And I went on a tangent there, but I really wanted to talk about this because it's very important and beginners don't do this. And that's partly why their music sounds boring. Let's talk about the third bit now, movement. I kept this for last, but it's not the least important. Actually, it's one of the most important aspects of any genre of music that you can write. I'm talking about details. The reason why professional music sounds professional is that it is full of details. And details are something subtle. There are many little tricks that you can put in your tracks to make them sound better. But it's not that there's one secret detail that is going to make your track sound amazing, but rather details are something you learn to add with experience, and with more experience you gain, the more details you learn how to add. The more details you add to your song, the more professional it sounds like. There isn't one mixing secret to get your track to sound amazing. Of course, there is the one thing I talked about in the number one mixing rule to get your tracks to sound professional, to take care of, so if you didn't check out the tutorial, go check it out. I'm gonna link in the description of this video, or you can look for it by searching on a YouTube search bar. But yeah, other than that one thing, details are the most important thing. So to show you what I mean, for example, check out this part here, the intro. So this part sounds like it has movement, but the reason for it, I'm gonna talk about that now. So for example, let me remove all the instrument that I added to create movement in this first bit. So I'm gonna take these and I'm gonna mute them. We remove all of these, and also we have to take some of the a bit of the harps and mute them too. So it's gonna sound like this. I mean, it's the same, right? It's a ba-ba-bum, ba-da-ba-da-ba-da-ba-bum. It's like the main arpeggio, but why didn't it sound interesting anymore? Well, because we removed the details and the movements, while the main base of this part is there. we don't have all the embellishment. So let's check out a few of the details I added in this bit to make it sound like it does. So there's this ba-da-bum, 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 and the thing I added on the second bar here is this first. Like, sorry, these guys. So there's a few things to explain here, and I didn't, well, anyway, we have this. There's multiple voices here. There's one that does like this, ba-da, 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 ba-da. And then there's ba-da, 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 this sort of arpeggio here. And this is a great way to create movements by using first, again, counter melodies, harmonization, and then arpeggios. We're gonna see that later too. But I did that sort of ba-da, 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 ba-da on other instruments as well. So we have that on celesta here. I muted the celesta, sorry. And I also did that on first violins and cellos and flutes. So if we play those ba-da, ba-da, ba-da together, they sound like this. Another thing I added is this on pizzicato cellos. Which is something that the harps, some of the harps are doing. So to create that sort of low end. And I also added this. Sorry, they're always muted. This. These are bass pizzicatos, and I use them in this track multiple times later on to create the sense of rhythm that we are not, not providing by not using percussion. So that's another detail you can add, pizzicato strings. But we're going to talk about that a bit later. The last thing I added that I forgot is this. These are tremolos, and I, of course, did dynamics automation. And using tremolos, like that sort of sound, it creates tension because it's like two tones kind of switching between each other. It's not one linear sound. It's like something that has movement in it, in the way it just naturally sounds. So if you use tremolos and you do tremolos wells like that, you can really create a bit of that tension increase. Like if I remove them, it's still interesting, but with that tremolo again, wow, it becomes way better. And I also use tremolo a bit here too. But this is just to create a bit of a bit of harmonies. I wanted to have that sort of a high tremolo, very, very, very tiny. But yeah, so that's an example of when you have movement and you don't have it. Other ways in which I used it maybe can be heard probably here. We have this. Just this rhythmic sort of a two-note arpeggio, and then we have another here. And a cool thing is that with this sort of notes, that if you're creating movements with a certain pattern or arpeggio, you might be like, oh, I'm just gonna do ba-da, 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 ba-da. But no, that's wrong. You need to. One cool thing you can do is to write it in function of the chord progression or in function of the harmony. So this thing, it's like a chord that just has this sort of movement. It's the difference between doing something like I don't know, like something like this and this. You sort of have that movement. And you can also as I did here, you can write this not with a consistent pattern, but you can change it like this sometimes. So you don't it's not like you need to just think of, oh, I'm gonna do this and copy paste it throughout. No, you can still add detail on the detail itself. So if you do that, it's just gonna make it sound even more realistic. So another example of detail can be heard in the harps here. For example, if you hear this part. If I remove the detail in the harps, this is what they sound like. Again, the face of the harp, the face of the track is there, the main melody is there, but we remove this, which is... You know? So this is an arpeggio, and it's a good example of what I meant by, you know, adding details on your details. On each repetition, you have this sort of like change in the pattern and stuff like that. And yeah, it just goes on for a while. And then, well, it's not perfectly humanized and all those things, but, you know, it does the job. It creates that extra sense of detail. And it makes sense because when you listen to an orchestra, you know, each single instrument has a human playing it, and humans can do so many things. They have so much to express. So when you compose orchestral music, you need to think as your VSTs, as humans. Give character to every single one. Think of, you know, the life that maybe the concert harp player has lived, and the life that, because when a, you know, a real player, a real instrument player plays an instrument, he plays it with, and the way he plays it is the culmination of his life, kind of. He's gonna put emotions into that represent his story, his influences, and all those things. And an orchestra is usually a body of 40, 60 people. So each individual person is gonna have a different story, different influences. And of course, they're gonna, you know, serve you as a composer to represent the idea you had, but still they're gonna bring a bit of their accents in place. So whenever you compose, especially if you're composing not for an ensemble, but for a soloist instrument like a harp or celesta or solo cello and stuff like that, try to add nuances and details in such a way that do represent the character of the player. Now in this case, they're gonna represent your character. This arpeggio sounds something like I would do if I were a harp player, while the vocals sound like something I would sing if I were Merete Solvet and stuff like that. So, you know, you need to try to really, for each instrument, try to add as many details as possible, where possible, especially if you feel like your track has a hole. In the beginning, this track sounded like this. But I thought, okay, there's something missing here. What is missing? Well, I'm not using rhythm, so what can I do? Well, I can add arpeggios, which are rhythmic, but they're still gentle. And I can, you know, play with harmonies in the arpeggio to give that, you know, sort of Alex Mukala feel to it, kind of. So that's what I did. And I also did that in this part. So we have a bit of movement here, actually. So we have this. Sorry, this. And again, this is just, you know, movement or a pattern that works in function of the chords. So what I mean in function of the chords is that these notes probably belong to the chord progression that is playing here. So you can even just play the notes in the chord progression in a rhythmic way and then change them in an interesting way. So that's what I did for the celesta, but it's the harps that sound very interesting. On the harps, we have 3 layers, actually. So one layer is playing the melody in this part as a layer. Then we have this. Which is doing the same thing as a celesta, right? And if I were to play this, they will sound okay. Sorry, play this with the rest. You know, you have the choir playing the main melody, the strings playing chords, and, you know, the celesta and the flute, etc. playing the movement. We have the movement already. But in every Final Fantasy cover that I make, I like to put the Final Fantasy arpeggio as a joke or a cameo. So I always think of, you know, subtle ways where I can hide this arpeggio. If you listen to every single Final Fantasy song I made, every single cover I made, you can hear this arpeggio somewhere if you have a great ear. So in this case, I chose to add it here as a detail, you know, for the movement, and it sounds like this. And here I'm just playing mostly like the scale, right? This is just the scale of this song played in different patterns and stuff like that, and stuff like that, you know. And it took me quite some time to write this arpeggio actually, but you know, in the end it works. So like it does create that sort of movement, right? So when you put it together with the rest, you just feel something in the background. It's not like it's the underdog. It's something that maybe you don't even listen until you didn't even notice until you listen to the song for 20 times, but it's there, you know. And your song needs to have replay value that way, you know. You need to have elements in the background that maybe just only you hear, and the listener will only hear that at the 30th or 50th listen. But that's how you can tell a great song from a basic song. So. And you can also use it to bring the track forwards. So in this case, before the track ends, this goes higher and higher. Like you hear it, it's like subtle in the background. You hear it, maybe you don't really notice it, but it's there, and it just adds to the harmonies to move the track forward. So all these notes here, all this background stuff that I showed you, it's movement, it's thought to make the track move somewhere. So another way in which you can, create movement is using these sort of transitory sounds that I showed you before, like the cymbals. You know, if I were to remove them, it wouldn't sound as clear that this was a transition. You know, it sounds a bit more random now. So use cymbals and the magimetals or timpani rolls if you want. This is very important because transitions and stuff are like punctuations to a book. You know, they don't change the content. They don't change the content of the book, but they make it way more easily to read, to interpret. So yeah, and another thing, and the last thing I want to talk about, I think, of course, Contra Melodies, as I showed before, a great way to create movement, harmonization, etc. They're great. I talked about them in the second module, Relaxation, but they're actually about the movement. So use Contra Melodies and harmonize your song, your melodies and stuff like that. That also can create movement. And the last thing, in this song, there's an absence of percussion, right? Because it's like fantasy, etc. But I still wanted to, first thing, if you don't use percussion, you might have a low-end lack, because percussion, they reside mostly in the low end. So if you don't use them, your track is gonna lack of low end, right? One thing you can do to solve that is, for example, do what I did here in the beautiful bit here. And use, sub bass and double basses and cellos, to feel that low end. And if you do use them, make sure to, always do the dynamics thing, make them go up and down with the rest. So using sub bass, as I mentioned in the tutorial, how to write what is called how to write warm sustained strings or something like that. Using sub bass create that certain sense of warmth, and it makes up for the lack of bass. But I also used another thing. I used string pizzicatos. I used them to create that sort of low end, but also to create rhythm. So an example of pizzicatos can be heard here. Or here. They are very subtle. They're not loud as they're just very subtle, this very subtle rhythmic sound in the back of the track. And if I remove them, for example, if I put them back, they sort of give the rhythmic foundation to the thing. They give it that warmth, that depth, because you now added some sound that are very low and rhythmic, but they're also gentle. They're not crazy like spiccatos. So as you see here, this pizzicatos again, they're just a background element that you might not even notice, but I still wrote them in a way that if you isolate them, they sound a bit detailed, you know? They're not bum, 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 but like bum, 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 bum. And you have two voices, one high voice and one low voice. So the low voice is just there to create rhythm. And in there, you also have bum, 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 bum. It's not like a bum, bum. So I added this like short note before, you know, each repetition, just to create that extra rhythm. And then the high voice is there to enforce some of the notes in the harmonies and to make the spiccatos a bit more, you know, spread. So, you know, you need to, even if you add like background elements, what I'm trying to say is that even if you're adding background elements who are just there to support, they're not there to be the protagonist, you need to make sure that they're as details as the protagonist elements in your song. Because the more details you can add, the better it's gonna sound. Now, you don't want to add details just randomly because you feel like, oh, I need to add details. Just do what I told you before. Think, if I were the freaking bass player here, the double bass player or the string player that plays these piccatos, how would I play it? Personally, if I had the instrument in front of me, would I just do dun, dun, or would I do tum, pa pum, pa pum, you know? So really think of you like the instrument player on the instrument you're writing for, and then write accordingly. So those are the many tips about how to realize the three main things that you need to realize to write this sort of music. Again, the first one is picking instruments that provide a fantasy vibe internally. The second one is writing music that sounds relaxing and easy to listen to. And the third tip is having movement and detail in your track. Now, this was a bit of an advanced tutorial. If you're, you know, a bit confused of what you just heard and you need more help, one thing you can do is to go on my website to book a private lesson with me, or you can go and check out all the tutorials I mentioned throughout this tutorial, which are going to be very useful. And the last thing I recommend you to do, if you feel like you need guidance on your path to becoming a professional composer and you need someone to point you the way, to tell you exactly what to learn in the precise order that you need to learn it to grow the fastest, etc., what I recommend you to get is the Evident Cinematic Music course, because it's pretty much, that course is made for that reason. It guides you through your learning path and it gives you a general overview, very in-depth, about how to compose modern orchestral music in the style of AAA films and games. That's a course that I took in the past, and it was, you know, 20% of what it is now in terms of content. But back then, it gave me a very solid foundation that I could build upon to get the skills I have and I use to make my tutorials and music now. So if you want to get guided there, check out that course. The link is going to be in the description of this video. So that is all for this video, and I think I'll see you next week with the trailer track. And also, guys, I was thinking about something. So if you've been following me, you might have seen that I've done a live stream once where I did live feedback. You guys sent me your tracks and I reviewed them live. And it was a bit problematic to do it on YouTube, but I was thinking that we could do it probably again on Twitch live. So I created a Twitch account, and if you guys want me to do it, then come follow me on Twitch. I'm gonna leave the link in the description. And if we reach a large enough number of followers on Twitch, then I'm gonna do more live streams where I review your tracks live, so we can have a great time together and grow up together. So that's all for this tutorial. I hope it helped. Let me know in the comments if you have questions, or if you want to, you know, leave a positive comments about what you learned. And I'll see you next week with a new one. Bye.